Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to Cannoning Remastered Episode 6. So, this video is going to be very heavy on the theory, and we're not going to be building any cannons for it. However, the mechanics that we learn in this video are essentially going to form the basis for pretty much everything that we do in the future. So, it's a very important video theory-wise. To get us started for this video, I'm going to show you a little base here. So this base, although it may look fairly easy, will actually take us a very large amount of time to get through this cannon. So we have 6 cobblestone walls, all covered in lava, like that, and then the spawner box is actually raised up, say 15-20 blocks above the ground. So in order for us to raid it with this concrete cannon or like a one stacking hybrid cannon, we're going to need to fire essentially 15 times, then blow a hole in the wall, then the next wall 15 times, blow a hole in the wall, and over, and it will take us quite a large amount of time in order to get the value in this base. So that means we're going to need an alternate method, and in order to start building up that alternate method, we need to talk about sand stacking. To get us started, let's talk about what we actually want to do here. So we want a method to stack multiple pieces of sand simultaneously in the same shot so that we can build the sand stack much higher on the wall and then blow a hole in the wall. So if we want to say stack 15 sand onto the wall, we're going to need to shoot 15 sand at the wall. Now, when the sand hits the wall, say it's all clumped together, all in one shot, and it starts falling, something quite interesting happens. Now, similarly to how we saw the TNT flight mechanics versus how the game sees them, sand essentially acts the same way. So we're going to imagine we shoot 15 sand or so up into this guider, across and into this wall. So say we hit the wall there. Now, what we will visually see is the sand will start with no velocity and it will start accelerating downwards, and it'll get faster and faster due to the effects of gravity. Now, that's not what the game sees. So instead of all 15 pieces of sand falling simultaneously, the sand actually goes one at a time in between each game tick. So if we say we start with our first game tick of flight here, the sand accelerates downwards. But instead of 15 sand starting at the top and instantly teleporting down, the game actually calculates one at a time. So the first piece of sand falls down first, then the second, then the third, then the fourth, then the fifth. Now, what that means essentially is when we get even faster at the bottom of this wall here, and say the next game tick is below or essentially at that bedrock there, what happens is the game will calculate the first piece of sand to fall. So the sand, say, falls from this game tick here, and then it hits the bottom here, and then it does the second piece, and then the third piece, and then the fourth piece, and then the fifth piece, all the way up to that top of that game tick there. And what that means is we can actually stack multiple pieces of sand depending on the velocity that we get out of it. So building on that principle there then, what happens if we have enough velocity to shoot the sand down from the top or where we're firing to the bottom in one game tick? Well, it's still going to follow the exact same pattern. It's going to stack one sand, so there it is, one sand from the top, and it's going to do two sand, three sand, four sand. Keep in mind, this is all within a game tick, so it looks instant to us, but to the game, it actually calculates them each individually. And what that means is if we provide enough of a force and give the sand enough downwards velocity that it essentially reaches or goes below the bedrock in a single game tick, we're actually going to be able to stack basically that entire game tick worth of sand. And that means we can stack a hell of a lot more sand than we could with a single shot. The next question we're going to ask then is, how do we actually get it to provide that velocity? Obviously, we can't rely on gravity to do all the work. So if we shoot the sand at the wall here, we're only going to get like a reasonably large amount of velocity right at the bottom. If we want to say stack from where we're shooting all the way to the bottom in one game tick, we'd probably need to shoot the sand 2,000 blocks into the sky. Obviously, that is not practical. So we're going to essentially try and add velocity from another source to this sand, and obviously TNT provides velocity to entities. So if we introduce a large enough TNT amount above that sand to shoot it down in one game tick, we can then stack that whole distance instantly. Now we're going to talk about upscaling this cannon here. What would happen if we say changed these 3 dispensers to 50 dispensers and we said that this piston could magically push 30 pieces of sand at once? Well, obviously it's still going to follow the exact same TNT mechanics. It's going to fly up, it's going to fly across, go out, hit the wall. Now, the issue that we're going to run into is we're not going to have any vertical separation between the sand and the TNT at the wall, and we're going to struggle to stack all the way at the bottom. We're going to get low exposure and therefore low velocity, and we're not going to stack that at all. So instead, what we're going to want to do is find some method of providing vertical separation between our sand and our hammer at the wall. To get that vertical separation at the wall, there's two main approaches that you can do it with. The first one is mechanical separation. Now, this style has fallen out of favor with the introduction of fusions. However, it's still handy to know, and it's still sort of important when you talk about U fusions and external barrels and stuff. So I'm still going to explain it. Basically, how the mechanical separation works is you use two separate guiders in the same barrel. So there's a few different ways to do that. I'm going to oversimplify it and say, like, we essentially just shoot the sand up into this block here and the TNT up into this block here, and that's how we're going to get the vertical separation at the wall. So the sand's going to triangle out like that, TNT is going to triangle out like that, and they're both going to hit the same block and then go forwards and hit the wall. Now, there's quite a few trade-offs with this setup. Although you may only need to shoot it with one power, you're still going to run into issues like this won't shoot through a 1x1 block hole. So this is going to shoot essentially through a 2x1 block hole, which makes it significantly easier to patch. You're going to need to be individually adjusting both X and Y guiders as well. And that's going to lead to a lot of issues with you essentially pretty much losing TNT or sand at the wall. So it's really quite a headache to deal with. Now, the second method that we're going to talk about is essentially gravity separation. The method that we'll talk about now, and the method that basically everyone uses, is gravity separation. So instead of relying on a mechanical difference between the blocks, we're going to essentially use a timing difference in the cannon to let gravity take over. What I mean by that is we're going to fire two separate shots at the wall. So our first shot, or our first power, is going to fire the sand at the wall. So sand goes across, comes back here, hits the wall, and then our sand will start falling. And we're going to use gravity to take advantage of the fact that the sand is moving down the wall. So now, at a certain amount of time later, we could fire a second shot, and that second shot will contain the hammer. And then when our hammer hits the wall, we have that vertical separation between the sand and the hammer, and that's going to allow us to stack. For the remainder of the tutorial series, we are going to be using the 2-power method with gravity separation. So the 1-power method is basically extinct nowadays. There's still some people that need to use it for very, very fast cannons, but that's stuff like 0.2, 0.1 second speed cannons. So now, I guess let's do a little bit more of a deep dive into this 2-power method. So obviously we're going to need 2 powers. Now, the timing separation is actually quite important here. Too early, you're not going to get enough separation between your sand and your TNT at the wall, and you're going to get a low amount of exposure. Too late, and you're going to introduce something called shot splitting. So if you say have quite a large delay between your first and second power, what may happen at the wall is your sand will hit the wall, your sand will start falling, and then someone patches in front of your next shot. And then your hammer will essentially hit this wall here. And because they have that separation now, it's not going to stack properly. So we're going to need to find timings that are good enough to allow us to stack efficiently, but not late enough that people can separate the shots easily. Another thing that that power difference will mean is the fact that you need to split your cannon essentially into 2 halves. So you will need one shot to go into your barrel for your sand and a second shot to go into your barrel for your hammer. So you will need to physically separate your sand and your hammer away from each other as well. And that will mean 2 separate sets of boosters, 2 separate sets of final boosters, and essentially your cannons from this point onwards are going to be broken up into halves. This setup here is going to be the setup that we use for the cannons in the next few videos. So I've split this cannon up into 2 halves. Now, your power here, we can double pulse. So what that means is we physically fire the dispensers in our power twice. Dispensers can fire at a maximum of once per 2 redstone ticks. And what that means is we can fire the dispensers at, say, 0, and then we can fire them at 2, which means we can reuse the power to do both powers. Now we need that timing separation between our sand and our hammer here. So what this will commonly look like in cannons is you will have two final boosters, one here for the sand at the back, and then one a little bit closer at the front for your hammer. Additionally, as well, we're going to need more sand. So the next thing that we're going to introduce in the next video is something called a sand compressor. What a sand compressor will do is essentially compact a large amount of sand into a small area without it solidifying to allow us to fire a large amount of sand into the barrel. Additionally, for the hammer as well, we're going to need to use more boosters to compact a larger amount of TNT into a spot that we can fire it all in the barrel. So as you can probably tell, complexity is starting to build with these cannons. That's going to wrap up all the content for this video. So it was probably a bit more on the boring side with the amount of theory I've tried to cram into this video, but hopefully it sets up a strong enough foundation that we understand how all the future mechanics with sand stacking work. Now, I'm going to go fully in depth into Order of Entities in a later video as well, probably after we do the 15 stacker. So don't yell at me if I've overlooked some stuff with regards to sand stacking.